I met Father James. I met you probably 7 years ago. It was before COVID for sure. In a narrative in various Catholic newspapers and publications where, you know, Tim Busch is on the far right and Father James is on the far left. And these are two opposite people, but our salon dinners and friendships over the last 7 years, people have been absolutely amazed of what's going on.
What happens when the internet decides two Catholics are enemies, but they decide to become friends anyway? I'm Jonathan Lewis, and that's the question at the heart of our first episode in our series of dialogues, Conversations in Communion. Today, we welcome two distinguished guests, Father James Martin and Tim Busch. Father James Martin is a Jesuit priest, editor-at-large of America Media, consultor to the Vatican Dicastery for Communication, and founder of Outreach Ministries. Father Martin's also a New York Times best-selling author and recently released his newest book, Work in Progress. Tim Busch is the co-founder of Napa Institute, the founder of the Busch Firm, the president and CEO of the Pacific Hospitality Group, and the founder of Trinitas Cellars. Father Martin, Tim, welcome to the Communion Project podcast.
Tim, as a little bit of a background, where did you grow up, and can you talk about an experience in your childhood that shaped you and that formed you today?
I've been a cradle Catholic at 71 years old, and I raised in a very, very small town outside of Ann Arbor, Michigan, about 1,000 people. And I went to a parochial school in a neighboring town, Tecumseh, Michigan, that was staffed by Adrian Dominicans. I was right next to Adrian, Michigan. And that is probably outside of my own family, the most important part of my faith formation. And I was taught by Dominican sisters in every class. But one of the things a nun said to me, an older nun, she was probably in her 60s. So when you're 7 years old, it's pretty old. She said, you don't just have to go to Mass on Sunday. Well, that was kind of the first time I ever heard such a thing. You can go to Mass during the week as well. And this is talking to a third grader, right? And so probably it just went over everybody's head. But to me, I took it to heart. And I started going to daily Mass every day. And it must have been strange to my parents and even to the local community to see a young man, third or fourth grade, riding his bicycle to the church and attending the 7:30 a.m. daily Mass. And I was an altar boy. And so, I knew the Latin Mass, at least the words. I didn't know what that meant. I attended daily Mass until I was a senior in high school and then regularly attended Mass during college, but really got back into it when I was 35 years old as part of Legatus, which is one of the things they try to expose you to is the daily Mass, a regular confession, and daily rosary. So that ritual for me has brought grace, but also discipline to avoid the narrow occasion of sin. And I think that's one of the things I try to preach to everybody, especially if you're high profile, is the devil's after you. We're in spiritual warfare. How about you? How did you get raised, and what made you become a Catholic priest?
Yeah, I grew up outside of Philadelphia in a town called Plymouth Meeting. I actually just read a book about this called Work in Progress, and people are interested in that. And I grew up in a kind of lukewarm Catholic family. My mom and dad were Catholic, but not super Catholic. I did not have the benefit of the Adrian Dominicans or any other Dominicans. I went to CCD, so I was a public school kid. My experiences of God were not really sort of understood at the time, if that makes sense, because I didn't grow up in a super religious family. I had one experience where I was on my bike and not going to daily Mass. I didn't go to a daily Mass until I was a Jesuit. In fact, as an aside, I didn't know what they did at a daily Mass. That's how dumb I was. I thought, well, do they have readings? Do they have? I didn't know what it meant because I thought, well, surely it can't be like a Sunday Mass, right? Because that's Sunday. And in any event, I was riding my bike when I was about 9 or 10 and crossing a meadow near our school, and had this really overpowering desire to kind of be in that meadow, to stay in this sort of place of beauty, to kind of understand the source of it, to sort of possess it, to enter into it. It's kind of hard to describe, but as I look back, it was kind of my first experience of a desire for God, I think, a desire for something more. A couple years later, I read C.S. Lewis's Surprised by Joy, and he described a similar experience, which enabled me to see, gosh, I think that's what was happening to me. But yeah, it wasn't until I knew the Jesuits that I really had any sort of Catholic education outside of CCD, and so my Catholic sort of knowledge was sort of frozen at age 9 9 or 10, so I had to
Mhm.
do a lot of catch up. You brought up the Mass, which of course is very important to me. What would you say the most meaningful experience you've had, Tim, of the Mass has been?
My favorite experience of Mass is in private chapels, and, I've had people who've never been in a private chapel before have a Mass and say, "This is totally different than being in an institutional church." Spiritually, it's been, a revelation. I think what happens to you at Mass, either during the Mass or sometimes afterward, incredible revelations come to us, and I think it's not just the saints that receive these revelations. We all do, but most of us, we just aren't prepared for it. We're not prepared for the mystical. We're prepared. We're so caught up in our society today in the last 75 years to, hey, we finally figured out how the world works. We think we do. We don't have it all figured out, but we know scientifically so much more than we knew many, many centuries ago. And somehow that's maybe made us think we're God and that God doesn't exist. And so the whole idea of the mystical is, what are you talking about? That's just like kid stuff. Those are story time things. And this is what the devil does to us. He cools us on faith and spirituality. It is a battle between good and evil. And the whole story of our lives is about that. And through grace, we protect ourselves against evil. And through apathy, evil just leaves us alone because we don't care, and that's where most people are in society, unfortunately. If we could explain the Mass better to our Protestant friends, we'd have unity. It is the recreation of Jesus' sacrifice for us. You celebrate the Mass, you have the hands that consecrate the body and blood of Christ. What's your revelation?
Well, Tim, it's great to hear you talk about the spiritual warfare too, because that's a very Jesuit concept. It's Christian concept as well. But that idea of the good spirits and the bad spirits, I think you're absolutely right. I think people don't get that. And when it's pointed out to them, sometimes it can be frightening. And I said, that doesn't mean you're possessed. It just means that you need to be careful of, the evil spirit and the good spirit. When I saw this question about the most meaningful experience I've had at Mass, I thought, I can't possibly answer that. There's so many. Probably the most emotional was not my own ordination Mass, because I was too nervous for that. But the first ordination Mass I went to as a candidate for the Jesuits in 1988, I'd never been to an ordination Mass. And for those of you who haven't been, an ordination Mass, I think, the most moving and elaborate and impressive and powerful Mass where they sing the litany of the saints and the priest prostrates themselves before the altar. That to me is way up there. And I usually get emotional with those Masses. But also a Mass that I went to when I was working in Nairobi with refugees at a Jesuit parish called St. Joseph the Worker that just blew my socks off. I'd never really experienced sort of African liturgy. But I'll tell you something that is kind of quietly moving to me. I find at times when I say the words of the Mass, whether it's at St. Ignatius in New York or my home chapel, I'm always blown away by take this, all of you, and eat of it. This is my body, which will be given up for you. And, it's funny. I believe in transubstantiation. I believe in the real presence. But I always think of something different, which I find very moving that kind of connects me with Jesus and connects all of us with Jesus, which is, Jesus took his body everywhere, right? I mean, he went from Nazareth to Cana to Jericho to Jerusalem to Calvary, right? And I think it's a reminder for us. I always think about this that we need to go to these places, right, and present Christ as we can. Just take Christ to these different places. So I've always found that really beautiful. So like we're not Jesus, of course, but we receive Jesus, and as Augustine said, become what you see, what you receive. We can, in a sense, take our bodies to these places. Like you take your body to Irvine to be with your friends at Napa. You take your body to the Salon Dinners. I've always found that really kind of moving, and I don't really see very much written about that. That our bodies, are these Christian bodies. Of course, Jesus is offering it in a different way, but that's one way that we can participate in that sacrifice. So I was really beyond just the real presence and the transubstantiation, which I believe in. I've always found that really kind of moving and powerful, and it's kind of quiet. And every time I say it, I say, how am I going to bring my body, myself, to a different place in the way that Jesus invites me to?
I met you probably 7 years ago. It was before COVID for sure. In a narrative in various Catholic newspapers and publications where, you know, Tim Busch is on the far right and Father James is on the far left, and these are two opposite, people, but our salon dinners and friendships over the last 7 years, people have been absolutely amazed of what's going on. What do you think causes this divisiveness by the narrative?
That's such a great question. I think some of it is unfortunately political. People are divided politically, and across the political divides, I think it's sometimes hard for people to talk to one another. And I think that people tend to translate that into church circles and say, I can't talk to someone who's progressive or traditional, forgetting that there's much more that we have in common than the small things that, keep us apart. And then it's just simple human nature. We tend to be lazy about trying to understand the other person, right? It's easier to just put person in the box. But I always laugh at the articles I read about you and me because they're usually almost always incorrect. What do you think, Tim? What do you think causes this kind of division in the church?
Well, I think the root of it is, like you suggested, we're all tribal. If you go back into ancient times, you were part of society and you either fit it in or you were thrown out to the outskirts to die. And some extent, that is what's going on here today. The increase in the amount of availability on social media, you can start a digital newspaper and write whatever you want. I read it and go, if I could do anything close to what these guys say I'm doing, I would be kind of like the Pope and the President of the United States. I don't even know how you tolerate some of the things that get said about you, but you're a gentleman, and I've shared that with a lot of people. Very kind, gentle, and you've really taken it for what it's worth. It's not worth much.
Some of the stuff I don't read. I think that's an
That's
important
probably a
part.
good idea.
And Tim, at some point, I do want to get to talking about the salon dinners because I think people are going to be fascinated by that. But I'll tell you something funny. One of the articles about the salon dinners that I participated in and that I've been happy to help you with was that each participant drank a bottle of wine, something like that. Now, I don't drink I don't drink at all, as you know, and I thought, a little fact checking might be helpful for some of these articles. So, yeah, how do I deal with the critique? The first thing is, I know that kind of work I'm doing is gospel based and is done within the church and with the approval of my Jesuit superiors. I also know that it's inevitable if you do a certain kind of work, and it's often my work with LGBTQ Catholics that upsets people. If you work with people in the margins, it's going to get you, come people who are going to oppose you, and that's part of the gospel message. But really, a lot of times, I just I just don't pay attention to some of this stuff. Can you talk about the salon dinners and how they came to be, and what you hope from them?
Yeah, we've been doing the salon dinners for a little over 3 years, thanks to your help and Father Ricky Manolo's help and Father Tom Gibbons in Los Angeles. Because of the narrative, if I were to invite what people might refer to as progressives to my home for a dinner, they would think it was a joke or a practical joke and ignore it. And so it required your sanction, your encouragement. Of course, you came to the first one, and they really developed nicely thanks to your cooperation over the last. I think we've done 15 of them, and we have one coming up, which you're going to participate in with Cardinal Dolan, to have him witness it because he's one of the great leaders of the church. We basically have 12 to 14 people, and we do celebrate mass, we pray the rosary, and that really brings people together. I mean, you really see how much commonality you have with those two expressions of faith. Then we have a reception. I'm sure somebody will drink a bottle of wine, but I'm not sure everybody could. And then we have a nice group photo so we can remember that. And we have the dinner, and we go around 2 minutes, give a little background about what we're doing. And we then ask, per your suggestion, for your favorite scripture verse and why it is and how it plays out in your life. In the evening's pretty simple. It really wraps up at 9:30 or 10. The last one went to almost 11. The people were having so much fun. And we really have had zero problems. Now, we don't get into ideological discussions. I mean, we can. I think once there was a discussion about the death penalty, which frankly, conservatives and liberals, they share different opinions among themselves about the death penalty. So that's probably an easier topic to get into because it's not really right down the middle. There are conservatives that are against the death penalty, and there are progressives that are in favor of the death penalty. But we don't intentionally go after those things. What we're really trying to do, and this is what we don't have in society, is we're not making friends. It's really hard to hate your friends. And so if you just classify them as enemy right off the bat, you don't have to worry about what you say or do to another human being, which is a creature of God and made in his image and likeness. And you just go out and say whatever you want. But once you start to get to know people, you're less inclined to be quite as candid or maybe as brutal about what your opinions are. So I think that's the whole purpose of salon dinners. Now, as you pointed out, how do you scale this? I mean, at 14 people every quarter, that's going to take a long time to get through the American Catholics. We've talked about the diocesan format, taking it out to the diocese, to the USCCB, to the parishes.
Yeah, Tim, I've been Catholic for 65 years and I studied church history. And I'm learning something. I never thought about this. I always thought about those ethnic parishes that are, oh, it's so wonderful that they were together. But you're right, it's probably because the Irish couldn't stand the Italians and the Italians couldn't stand the Germans. I think that the scale of the dinners is really important. And you and I have been talking about at some point trying to expand it because, as I've told you privately, I think this is kind of the synod in action. So I was a member of the Synod of Bishops, which was all about dialogue and initially becoming friends. And I think I told you that one of the lines that was a quote from St. John Paul II, which was affective collegiality precedes effective collegiality. And I really saw that at the Synod, and I see that at the Salon Dinners, that the first thing you need to do before you can talk about any difficult issues, the death penalty, whatever, is to become friends. And that doesn't mean you have to become best friends with people, but to become friendly and to get to know the person, as a fellow Catholic. And so I think that these dinners could be replicated, in some way in parishes and dioceses as ways of sort of implementing the synod. Let me ask you, so this is a hard one. What breaks your heart about the church today?
I'm an optimist. I do believe the church is on a move to return. We've had the most Catholics baptized and confirmed this past Holy Saturday than we've had, I'm told, in 25 years. And it's not singled out in one particular area. Like New York is not ahead of Washington and Washington's not ahead of LA. It's all over. And I think the spirit is upon us. And you could say, oh, it's the 500th anniversary of Our Lady Guadalupe, which converted more people in South America than left the church in the Reformation, or it's the 2033 anniversary of Jesus's death and resurrection. And I think those are all important things, as it is this year for the 250th anniversary. Just you got to mark time, because otherwise you just go through life. If you don't mark time and reflect back on where we're at, how are we going to know where we're going? We had a transition pope in Pope Francis, which I wanted to get into with you because you knew him better than anybody I know. And we had John Paul II, and we had Benedict XVI, and a lot of fundamental teaching was academic teaching, philosophy and theology. I would call him John Paul II philosophy and Benedict XVI theology. And then Francis came along, and he's mercy and love. You see this in this papacy as well. Leo the 13th is everybody takes whatever words they want, and then they go, this is what the Pope said, and therefore supports my position on such and such a thing. And I think before you didn't have that capability. Individuals did not have that capability to go out and proffer new concepts and ideas. It was done by 3 television stations, and they probably didn't talk about religion that much. They were talking about news. And so there wasn't this opportunity to spin what was going on truly in the church. And even when I give statements and somebody prints it, I go, what? I didn't say that, but that's what they want. They want you to spend it. So I think division is probably the biggest concern that I have. I mean, one could go back and say, "Oh, well, gosh, don't you think the abuse crisis is bad?" Of course it is. I mean, it's terrible. And the church about 15, 20 years ago, a friend of mine said, when we're done, we're going to have $1 billion transferred from the church to victims and lawyers and so forth. And today it's 10 billion. And the church is having the most incredible resurgence it's seen in 25 years. How's that possible? Everybody should be running from the church based on what the public media is saying. But that's what's so amazing about the Spirit of Jesus Christ is that he transcends all of this stuff. And so I think the division hurts me in my heart to see that. But in fact, Jesus transcends it all. I, I ask you the same question: what bothers you about the church? And then maybe as a follow up, how did Pope Francis and his papacy address these issues? And how does Leo the 14th, who's just getting his sea legs? I mean, he's a few days away from his first anniversary of the election, and how do you see him navigating these waters?
Yeah, I would say the same thing breaks my heart, which is the division. I mean, I think, as you say, we are still dealing with the fallout from the sex abuse crisis, and I think the goal from the USCCB a couple of years ago was to make sure that the church is kind of a model of how to deal with this, which I think is a very good goal, so that other organizations, because it's obviously not just a Catholic problem, can look to us. Any new cases come up are cases from a long time ago. And I think the idea that any priest credibly accused is removed makes sense, right? But I agree that the division is really kind of shocking to me. I have a friend who says that the motto of the Catholic Church sometimes seems like it's see how they shove one another instead of see how they love one another. And I find that really sad. I saw a lot of that even at the synod, even when we were, sort of there for a month, trying to talk to one another. There was quite a bit of division, and I think that is kind of a scandal. Pope Francis, who I really loved and I think was a saint, his intervention before the conclave that elected him was about turning the church outward. And I think that makes a lot of sense, turning the church outward towards the poor, mercy, compassion. My sense is that Pope Leo, who I know slightly, is continuing in the line of Pope Francis in terms of his emphasis on mercy. But with this, when we look at the United States, I think I can say this. I told him this too, and I think this is accurate. I think that both progressives and traditionalists dislike disunity. So there's no one who wants disunity and division and hatred and contempt, the kind you see, particularly online. And I think there's a lot of goodwill that's being invested in Pope Leo because people want to be brought together again. And I think he's doing a great job. I think he's done certain things, said certain things, made certain gestures, even worn certain things that are telegraphing to different kinds of Catholics that I'm not opposed to you. I'm with you. His motto is in the one we are one, right? And of course that is in Jesus Christ. So I think he can do it too. I really think he can do it. So I find that the thing that breaks my heart the most these days, in addition to the fallout from the sex abuse crisis, is, I mean, it doesn't seem to stop people from joining, right? And I think also a lot of this is very sort of inside baseball. I mean, most people, when they go to their parish, they're not hearing about this stuff. They love the mass, they love their pastor, they love OCIA, they're happy about that. And I think that's all to the good. So I'm going to ask you, what fills my heart about the church today? I'll answer that and then I'll ask you the question. I think that the church is always the herald of the gospel, and that fills my heart. And when I see not only just the revivification of parishes and people joining in great numbers, which I think is fantastic, I think that Pope Leo's trip to Africa filled my heart because there he was just preaching the gospel. And I had all these people calling me because there were some, political things going on at the same time. And they said, don't you think it's great that, Pope Leo is responding in this way to the White House? And I said, he's preaching the gospel. I mean, that's what he's doing. And he's not responding in a sense to anybody. And I thought that was just great. He goes to Africa, he preaches the gospel, people hear it, and That's what continues to fill my heart, which is what Francis did and Benedict did and John Paul did, that there is someone that we can rally around, the Vicar of Christ, and they've all done great jobs preaching the gospel in different ways. Let me share something that a little bit off topic, maybe they'll edit this out, but I've often thought when we look at different ways of living out the gospel and different ways of being Catholic, I've often looked at two people I really admire, St. John Paul and Pope Benedict XVI. Both of them were faced with the same dilemma. Should I retire when I'm old and infirm? St. John Paul said that I can't renounce my paternity, right? And he kept on until his death, from Parkinson's disease and other complications. Pope Benedict decided that for the good of the church, he would resign. So I think one of the things I really love about that is it shows that people discern in different ways, people approach their ministries in different ways. They're both holy and they're both legitimate. Both those ways are legitimate. So that I've always thought that example gives me a lot of hope in that there are different ways of being Catholic and different ways of discerning. So that fills my heart too. What about you? What fills your heart?
I think the church is the moral compass of the world. The fact that anybody pays attention to the Pope is in and of itself a little bit miraculous. We saw this in the fall of the Berlin Wall with Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and John Paul II, and the three of them. What did John Paul II have that was going to, he didn't have any warships and he didn't have a nuclear bomb and he didn't have anything, but he had the mystical body of Christ. He had the spiritual and moral compass of the world. And I think Ronald Reagan, as a Protestant, and Margaret Thatcher surely recognized that. And it's unfortunate, and I'm not trying to criticize any political movement that's underway today, but we brought one of the greatest, regimes in the world down without shooting one bullet. And it was done through prayer. And it took a while, as abortion's taking a while to undermine. The church has a role. And I preach about this, and I'm fascinated that many Catholics don't appreciate this. We're the only church that has what we call the magisterium, which Americans might better understand as a constitution. We have a moral compass that is encapsulated within the magisterium. We have the original Bible. I mean, we control the original Bible in the Vatican Library. And no other faith has this. The Jewish faith is made up of rabbis who interpret the Torah, just like evangelical preachers interpret the Bible. The Muslim faith, they have the Quran, and imams interpret it one way, another imam interprets it another way, just like any human being. And so there's no centralized teaching pulpit that people can point to and say, this is the magisterium. And there's always nuances. That's one thing, but just flat out different teaching, it doesn't exist. And I think it was God's plan that the Catholic Church would hold this truth. And it is through truth that ultimately everybody in society has to gravitate toward. And so I think that's what the Pope's talking about. And I think it's very important. This is not a critique of the Pope, and it's probably happening. We just don't know about it. I think it's very important that the President of the United States of America, whoever that might be, and other leaders have regular confidential dialogue about the issues of the day, as did Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and John Paul II. They need to become friends. They need to trust each other. The world is in their hands. And if they were to take a wrong move, there's going to be a different result. Thousands and millions of people could perish. And so I think God's plan is that they must communicate. They must have their salon dinner and get to know each other. And I think that was what really was special about the tripartite relationship of the three of them, was they really trusted each other. They each had their other's back. And they knew communism was not truth, and we needed to bring it down because it prohibited religions and it prohibited freedoms. And so this is where I think is important in the coming months that we're in a real problem here. Things go certain ways, we could be back in World War III here. And so I think it's important that we prevent that, and God will, I'm confident, encourage these leaders to get back together and move and talk about the gospel, and how it can be applied in today's circumstances.
No, I agree. And I also think I was hearing something recently that I thought was great when they were talking about just war. And they said that the Catholic Church doesn't have to invent things, to comment. We already have this system of moral theology for 2,000 years. And even, you've probably heard the story that pretty soon the Holy Father is going to release an encyclical in part about AI. And there have been people going to the Vatican for years. There was an article about this in the New Yorker asking the Vatican for help.
I think there's two things there. One is just war, which is a hot one, but just getting back to AI, which is kind of the easy one. The Vatican has been convening AI conferences for the last probably 2, 3 years, for at least 2 years. And it's not just Catholics, it's people of all different faith stripes. But people are Protestants and Jews and even Muslims, when they get invited to the Vatican for a conference, they're like, I'm going. And these people are very excited. We have a group at Napa Institute. So every summer we have this conference, 800 people. It's in the Napa Valley. It's been going on 15 years. And last year, unbeknownst to me, because we're located 1 hour and 30 minutes from Silicon Valley. Now, like it or not, that's where all this AI stuff's going on. And without my knowledge, hijacked one of my own personal tasting room and had a conference on the Catholicity of AI and teachings and so forth. And I was like, wow, this is incredible. It's infectious and it's providential. And this year, we're going to have an intentional, organized conference inside of our conference about the subject of AI. There's something going on. I use AI every day, but there's something going on with the coders of AI. They know something we don't. I think God will guide us, and through its use. And just like the automobile caused accidents that wouldn't happen on horse and buggy, but in a lot of things they've benefited us, obviously. So we just need to harness it. And thank God people are looking toward the church as opposed to ignoring them and writing them off. And these are people that maybe now don't even have faith, but I think they're going to find faith if we can express our faith to them in its authentic form. This is why Leo XIV took his name, because of Leo XIII. We know what happened in the Industrial Revolution. We also have a rising tide. Economic growth, lower and middle class, is marching along very, very quickly. And the beautiful thing about AI is you don't have to quash down people, because people are not a critical element of AI. Now, people will always have jobs. There's always going to be things for them to do. Internet did not wipe out jobs. But I think everybody's afraid this is going to be like the Industrial Revolution, where you have wealth in the hands of 10 or 12 people, and everybody else is just slaves to these factories. But no question here, I think you're going to see a democratization, because every single human being, whether in India or Africa, has a cell phone, and they can use AI with the cell phone to do whatever they need.
I think you're right about the Vatican, providing a unique resource, for these people. And I'm just glad. I don't know where it's going. I may be a little less sanguine than you about AI, but I'm glad that the Vatican is weighing in, that they are using the Vatican as a resource, because I think you're right. There's no other locus for this kind of moral thinking going on. Now, Tim, what is one thing you suspect we see differently? Why is it important to you? And what do you wish more people understood about that topic?
The whole idea of marriage between man and woman, or marriage between two men or two women, these are issues of the day. And I'm anxious because you met with the Pope early on in his papacy. He probably hadn't formulated some of the ways he was going yet. But, he said a couple weeks ago, we need to address other issues. And I'm not sure how you would interpret that statement, because to me, it's a few simple words, but it seems like it's continuance of this addressing some of the other commonalities as opposed to focusing on some of these differences which crop up as a result of the secular society.
He's basically continuing what Francis said, which is that there are other issues. And I think, as Leo said, and we have to be careful, and I know you are, it was an off the cuff remark on a plane. But, when he was asked about blessing same sex couples under certain circumstances, he started the answer by saying, there are things that are more important than sexual morality. It's not like it's not important. But I think that so many people have this idea of the Catholic Church as only concerned with issues below the belt, and he talked about issues of justice and peace. So I was glad he made that corrective. And Francis made that a couple of times as well, to sort of get people away from looking at that all the time. Another question is, what does it mean to be in communion with one another as Catholics? And I know you've been thinking a lot about this with the Salon Dinners. What would it look like to live this communion more fully? What would you say to that? Communion with other Catholics.
Beautiful thing about going to church is you walk in and everybody's there, right? There's no special seat for somebody that's got a job here and has this net worth or that academic recognition or that place in society. We all sit together wherever pew happens to be open. I always wonder about these words social justice as a business guy. We probably have 4 or 5,000 employees. Um, I think I tell my peers, Mother Teresa was very important, obviously a saint, worked for the poor, she was selfless. I say your job is more important than Mother Teresa's because your job is going to impact more people than Mother Teresa did. Now, her sisters and her movement may have impacted more people, and it's because who you employ and when you employ them and how you employ them and how you educate them to come to work on time, to be responsible and to be accountable. Some of these things they have not learned in their own family and their own neighbors and their own society. And when you bring them to a job, you are performing a work of social justice because that person is not going to be on the streets of Calcutta to be picked up because they're on your health insurance and they have a job and they're able to, through dignity, work in that job and buy their own food and pay their own rent without relying on government subsidy, which is one of the greatest things we have as an opportunity in this new AI society is cut the government dole and get the private people like it was in the years of Tocqueville, helping each other out of caritas, out of love. This is what's missing in our whole social justice program here in the United States and really probably elsewhere, but particularly here in the United States where we have this printing press that we just hand money out to people and we really destroy them instead of having us help each other.
Yeah, we might see that a little differently. I would say that I went to Wharton, as you know. I am a capitalist. I think capitalism is the most efficient distributor of goods and services. But I think there does need to be a safety net, which I do think is where the government comes in. I would say, it's interesting, your point about Mother Teresa, and we're asked to look at what patron saint do we need at this moment in our country. I found one of the most wonderful things about Mother Teresa was when people would come to her in Calcutta and say, I want to work with you in Calcutta. And this is to your point, Tim. She would say, find your own Calcutta, which I love, that we're all called to be, as you're saying, kind of Mother Teresa's in our own ways. I always say to people, you don't need to be Mother Teresa. There already was a Mother Teresa. You need to be holy in your own life. I'd also point to, we're talking about patron saints, and I'll ask you this question. Dorothy Day, who I love, and who was a friend of Mother Teresa. There's a great picture of them in 1980. And I think, again, it's like John Paul and Benedict that I talked about before at different ways of approaching things. They had different ways of approaching poverty. Both of them dealt with the poor one-on-one, the missionaries of charity and their hospices. I worked with them in Jamaica for a while, and Dorothy Day in her houses of hospitality. I think the difference was that Dorothy Day also critiqued the systems that keep people poor, which I find helpful. So one of my favorite images, I think I heard this in a homily, is the story of the town that's on a river. You've probably heard this, and corpses keep coming down the river and they bury them and they take care of them. And then more corpses keep coming down the river and they bury them and they give them Christian burials. And one person says at one point, we should probably figure out what's going up the river, and they find pollution and stuff. So I always thought Dorothy Day was a great example of that. She's asking, what keeps people poor and what has to be looked at.
Dorothy Day is the solution. See, it's a person and a movement that helped those people lift them up, not a government. And this is what we're missing. The safety net should be private. It should be privately funded. The church was the safety net, and we got usurped by the government because they had more money. They had a printing press. And I think you need subsidiarity and you need love, but you also need accountability. And I think it can help. They have the resources and the know-how to do this. This is what we need to call upon them for.
So, what patron saint, Tim, do we need most at this moment in our country? Now, of course, I'll say that with the proviso that they're all praying for us already, but who would be a good model, and patron for us right now?
Yeah, I look to Our Lady Guadalupe, and she's also the patroness of Napa Institute. She's a unifier, right? I mean, she came into a society that was pagan and she converted them into Catholicism.
Before we close, what are you taking away from our conversation, Tim? And is there anything you want to share with me before we close? And then I'll respond.
Well, I think this is a continued dialogue among friends. And I'm so appreciative that you would give me the time over the last 7 years to take us seriously about what we're trying to do. And I think the trust has been incredible. And so thank you. The people that watch this podcast would be completely blown away that we were having a civil conversation about some of these issues, which is the only way we're going to solve these things.
Yeah, and I would say I'm just grateful for your presence in my life and in the church. And they should also know that we have these conversations over lunch. I think people think that what we're doing is debating. And frankly, a lot of times we're talking about Lords and why we like Lords and why we like this certain hymn or something. So I hope people take that away from the conversation as well. I want to thank you for your friendship and also for the Salon Dinners, which I really think are a way forward. And you're right, to be able to scale them up and to be able to invite people into dinners, which are, as I've said to you before, mini synods, or at least a precursor to more conversation, is a wonderful thing. So thank you for doing that. And I look forward to seeing you in person.
Thank you both. If you had one piece of advice for ordinary Catholics in the pews, what should they do to cultivate the spirit of dialogue?
Pray and pray often. That's what brings grace.
Yeah, I would not argue with that. I would say a couple things. I'd say listen carefully, right? And listen without getting ready to rebut. That's hard for Americans. That's hard for people in the West. Be humble, meaning be open to the fact that you actually may be wrong about something or may not know something. And then also, I think the other thing is be free of the need for the other person to approve of you. I mean, it's great to be friends and everything, but you don't need to have everybody like you, love you, or like you. And I think you just have some freedom going into these conversations. But the most important thing is listen, because people don't listen anymore. They're ready to go to the next thing, and I think that's essential. So listening, humility, and just learning.
Well, Father Jim, Tim, thank you both for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you, Jonathan.
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining today's conversation. The Communion Project is an initiative of the Paulist Fathers. Be sure to visit our ever-growing resource library at communionproject.org to explore videos, articles, parish resources, and prayers for building unity and communion in our church. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, become what you receive.